Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you to all of our online viewers for joining us on today's webinar. My name is Francesca and I'm the Marketing Specialist here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm very excited to introduce today's presentation of Project Tweetbox, Investigating China's Cyber Influence Operations. In this webinar, our speaker will discuss his research into China's cyber disinformation campaigns and their operators. Our LookingGlass presenters for today's session are Tom Creedon, Senior Managing Director of APAC region. And before we begin, I want to run through a few housekeeping notes and reminders for the BrightTalk webinar platform. Please note on screen that there is a chat window where you are free to submit any questions that you may have for our presenters. We will be addressing these questions at the end of today's presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run out of time to go through all of the submitted questions, we will be sure to contact you directly following the presentation. Please note, any questions submitted through the chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So, if you prefer to have a question addressed privately, please indicate so in your comments and we will contact you directly if desired. Also note the attachments and links section on your audience screen. We have a resource there for you to peruse at your convenience relevant to today's topic. Lastly, and very importantly, if you'd like to obtain 1 hour of CPE credit towards your professional certification for viewing today's webinar and did not enter your membership number when you signed up for the session, please send it to us via the chat window. All you have to do is simply enter your number and BrightTalk will tell us which viewer it came from. You can enter it at any time during the webinar. So without further delay, I will go ahead and pass this over to our presenter to kick off today's webcast. Tom, please take it away.
Thank you, Francesca. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Creedon, Senior Managing Director of Asia Pacific at LookingGlass Cyber. I've got a background back in iDefense, Aon Strauss Friedberg, previous life in NSA and NavSecGru and a number of other organizations. Want to thank Kristen Dennison and John Condra for all your help and support in reviewing the presentation. Today I'd like to talk about what we're calling Project Tweetbox. Basically, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at some of China's influence operators, information operations associated with certain campaigns, the influence, the targeting, the messaging, and then we'll also talk a little bit about intimidation and pacification by the government of China associated with these operations. We started this back in September of 2019, and it kind of came about after Twitter went ahead and did their full dump of what they saw as inauthentic accounts. We were taking a look at some of the data associating with those accounts, and we understood it to be an organized operation, but we weren't necessarily convinced that it was an effective operation. So after they had taken down the accounts that they posted in August, we decided to start our own collection along these accounts. We'll also make note that these type of Twitter operations emanating from the People's Republic of China have been going on for quite some years. If you look at the photo to the right, this is from a researcher. It goes by the handle of Lao Yan, and he was identifying Twitter accounts very similar to what we're seeing today back in 2014 and 2015. It's not a full-time research project. We'd spend probably about a day or two a week trying to collect, identify operator patterns, understand what their targeting is, where their campaigns are directed, and also to do some assessment of impact and, if possible, attribution. Just to mention that Twitter is only one of many mediums and campaigns that China is involved in, and we will touch lightly on some of those other mediums. Some real simple Chinese or China-based disinformation would be an example of China Daily and some retweets. In this case, we have an example with the Hong Kong protest where China Daily, which is a mouthpiece for the PRC government, was attempting to indicate that the U.S. weapons, in this case a grenade launcher, was being used by the protesters in Hong Kong. A little bit of research by some military folks I know, including myself, indicates, and also talking to some of the protesters in Hong Kong, that it was actually an airsoft device that was made in China and marketed in China in Taobao. After a lot of this came up to light, we started to see a lot of these airsoft guns, such as the M320 grenade launcher, being taken off the Taobao market. Some background on the players' terms that are frequently used with PRC operations. 50 center, you may have seen that. There are a number of reports out there talking about 50 centers, or Wu Mao, as they say in Mandarin. It's a term that originally came out of Changsha back in the early 2000s with a government posting offering to pay 50 cents to anybody that would become an online commentator. At that time, it was associated with online commentators, sock puppets that were working for the government. It was primarily internal work. You would find them on, at the time, Hotmail, Yahoo were still very popular, QQ. You would see them, but it was all internal-facing online commentating. Currently, the term 50 center can be applied or is applied to just about anybody that you have an agreement with in the sinosphere out there. So if you look at any of the mediums, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, Weixin, PTT, Line, when people tend to have political arguments, the term 50 center is thrown in there, and it's lost a lot of its original meaning. Other terms that tend to be associated with these online operators would be the Water Army, Shuijun, Net Army, Wangjun. That's a very common term that's used in Taiwan when they're discussing PRC influence operations. Then we also have operators that are self-styling themselves as Fanjuannu, Diba Chuzheng, or D8. These are more or less cyber vigilantes that go out and dox people that may make comments that run counter either to the leadership of the PRC or just the PRC in general. And then, of course, patriotic overseas students, which we're not really sure where their direction is coming from. Is it authentic patriotism, or is it something that's being guided through the party? Finally, we have what we would consider useful idiots or fellow travelers, to use terms out of the Cold War. These are folks like Robert Chow in Hong Kong, which I'll speak about in a little bit, that organize, set up websites, and generate content that is supportive of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China. And then finally, the government directly. That would be the United Front, and I'll speak about that in a little bit. These are the Chows. We have Vanessa and Robert Chow, and starting during the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, they began to gain traction with a significant amount of pro-PRC, pro-Beijing information countering the Umbrella Revolution. They are both from Hong Kong. Mr. Chow is a well-known reporter. Ms. Chow is a senior executive with Cathay Pacific. We've seen their websites up for a number of years. They have a presence on Facebook. Their presence on Twitter was taken down, and we've seen it interspersed with some of the activity that we are seeing from China. So the HK silent majority, the last time I checked, was no longer active. But what we did observe is that some of the content that the Chows had put on their websites that are pro-Beijing mid-sect, they're calling themselves the silent majority in Hong Kong, opposing both the Umbrella Revolution and the current protests now, have tended to cross over into some of these inauthentic operators or these bots that we're observing on Twitter. The government itself, this is an overly simplified organizational view. We could probably list out approximately 100 different organizations within PRC's central government, but there are three main organizations that are associated with influence ops that are coming out of China. The United Front Work Department, the Youth League, the Communist Youth League, we see a lot of their operations. They tend to maintain a very heavy web presence. And in a little bit, I'll show you some of their recruiting attempts to get people to come on and support some of the influence operations, along with the People's Liberation Army. We have not observed in any of the activities that we've been researching under Tweetbot any PLA-type activity, nor have we been able to tie back anything directly to the central government. Let's speak about Tweetbox a little bit, and starting that off, we'll go back to the Twitter dumps. We did as a baseline the two sets that came out in July. One of the things is really important to understand is there's a lot of noise within these dumps, and there was a lot of noise when we began to collect in September after these dumps. And this is an example of while the dumps look fairly large, the majority of the content is irrelevant to Chinese influence operations. You'll notice that we have Arabic, we have other tags out there that have nothing to do with influence operations. Our unique irrelevant hashtags was over 65,000, and only about 23,000 plus of the hashtags that we identified were associated with Chinese influence operations. And while this may seem strange at first, this comes about because there was heavy use of compromised accounts. Aged accounts, they'd purchase them from miscreants online, and they'd use an account that may have been opened in 2010. It would have a real operator. They lost control of their account. It was compromised, and then later on, whoever compromised the account would sell the account as an aged account. In some cases, they would remove all the previous tweets. In other cases, they would just leave the previous tweets. So you have these accounts that appear to be authentic, or at least initialized as authentic, but at some point in time they become compromised, and then they're taken over, and then they're resold to be used for these influence operations. So our idea was to start from scratch. We had the dumps. Those accounts had already been taken down. We had the data from those accounts that Twitter provided. But what we wanted to do is start from scratch, see if we could develop any type of operator patterns and profiles that we could use for tracking or possibly automating identification of these inauthentic operators. Vacuum up everything that we could from the Twitter feeds or from anything that might be associated with them. Apply some metrics to see what type of patterns we might develop with regard to the profiles, and also attribution. And as I stated in the beginning, we weren't able to tie this directly back to the PRC government. We didn't use the Twitter API. We used Twint, and a significant amount of manual labor going out, hunting, pecking, searching for these operators, searching for this content, and then pivoting off of the operators to see if we could identify other operators. This is basically what we found over 3,000 accounts. It's a Maltego chart. We're more than happy to share our Maltego file and most of our raw data with anybody that asks for it. So if you'd like to take a look at it yourself, bring it up on Maltego, build on it, please feel free to reach out to us. We can give you an account list, and we can give you the full Maltego file. The Maltego file we basically broke up as we were collecting on these into theme, hashtag, and then what we call a broadcaster and a repeater. A broadcaster would just be doing a tweet. A repeater would be retweeting, commenting, or liking. One thing to notice, this is a subset sample. It tended to be an echo chamber. We didn't see very much actual interaction with non-authentic accounts. They tended to talk among themselves, and it was very, very rare that we would see that was anybody that was outside of being an inauthentic operator, or as a lot of people call them, bots. They would not tend to operate, interact with other folks. So in this case, we don't have any C2s. We have some sub-spec accounts. We have some locked accounts, or accounts that have been locked since we started monitoring them. We think there may be some tie in there with them being command and control based upon the messaging that was going out, but we still can't confirm them. We don't, in this example, we don't have any authentic accounts actually interacting with these operators. I will show you an example of an authentic account interacting with them, but for the most part, these operators, they just talked amongst themselves. The targeting of the campaigns was very limited, very narrow scope. One would be the Hong Kong protest, the current Hong Kong protest. The second would be a gentleman named Miles Kwok, or Wengui. He is a billionaire that fled from China when accused of a number of crimes, and then also Xinjiang. One of the items that we didn't see a significant amount of would be the Taiwan 2020 elections. We did expect to see a significant amount in other channels, but not in Twitter. Twitter is not very popular in Taiwan, and while we did see some activity in Facebook and PTT and some other social media channels, we rarely saw it within the Twitter domain. Within the Hong Kong protest campaign, the common messages were focusing on any kind of violence, support of the CCP, solidarity of unification of the country, law enforcement. Occasionally, we would see content that was associated with foreign influence. If you note on this tweet here, you'll notice that HK silent majority is being tweeted, and that's where these are the tweets that we started to see a crossover with the Chows that I mentioned earlier. One comment I'd like to make about the Hong Kong protest campaign is we also see frequent use of dehumanization. One of the terms, Cantonese term for cockroach. We also see the protesters themselves with their online campaigns and at the street level also engage in these terms of dehumanization. In the case for the protesters, they tend to call the mainlanders locusts. In the case of the mainlanders, they tend to use the term cockroach when identifying Hong Kong citizens. Again, here's another example of what the content is with the English translation. I won't read through it, but common hashtags or commonly calling the Hong Kongers thugs, focusing on the violence, focusing on the destabilizing effects of the protest, but staying within that realm, not getting in too much of a political discussion, but focusing on the violence, the family, the unity of the Han people, and the unity of the People's Republic of China. The second main thing that we saw on Twitter was associated with the Wengui campaign, or Miles Kwok. As I mentioned, Mr. Kwok, Mr. Guo, is a People's Republic of China citizen. He's a billionaire. He fell out with the Communist Party leadership, fled to the U.S. in 2014. Since his arrival in the U.S., he's been very outspoken against the Communist Party of China. China itself, the Chinese government, accuses him of things such as bribery, kidnapping, fraud, rape. New charges tend to come up on a regular basis, and he considers himself a self-proclaimed whistleblower. He himself has a very heavy social media presence, uses Twitter on a daily basis, and this campaign primarily focused on accusing him of being a criminal and also those associated with him of criminal activity. Mr. Kwok has an interesting relationship with certain U.S. politicians. They have also been drawn into the campaign. Specifically, Steve Bannon is a frequent target of these operators from China. Whenever you see a Miles Kwok tweet that's associated with these operators, you'll frequently see names like Steve Bannon or any politicians that he tends to have interaction with. This is a case of where we're also hesitant to use the term disinformation on these campaigns because we can't necessarily prove truth on either side, whether the CCP allegation or the Chinese government allegations are correct with regard to fraud or crimes, or whether Mr. Kwok's allegations against the CCP government are correct. So we're really hesitant to consider this a disinformation campaign. It's very messy. He said, she said, and then we also have some messiness with reporters that are involved in this. We've actually had some reporters where they appear to be potentially on his payroll. Again, we don't classify this as disinformation because we can't confirm or deny anything that's been being said from either side, but we can observe an operational pattern. The third campaign is very different from the first two. The first two are very aggressive, attacking, focusing on violence, focusing on criminal activity. The third campaign is a little bit quieter on Twitter. with these operators, but it also is, it has a much softer tone, a much softer touch. They don't tend to focus on countering directly any of the claims or bringing into vision the concept that the central government in Beijing has that they're re-educating Uyghurs because of terrorism. They don't really focus on those topics. The campaigns tend to look more like a travel magazine. A significant amount of videos regarding food, culture, the people, but the people in much more in kind of a cultural setting. This case, we have folks dancing, traditional dance, traditional Uyghur dance. Again, you won't see anything as violent or accusatory except for the hashtags. In this case, we actually have where they'll use the English term concentration camp. In fact, they've actually used the account name is associated with the camps. So they will use hashtags that are associated of what is being accused of transpiring within Xinjiang, but the media content that's associated with it, that's being either automatically generated or generated out with the bots, tends to be much softer than any of the other campaigns. Let's take a look at themes here. This is from the Twitter dump, and what we see here are hashtags associated. These are hashtags that we identified within the collection, over 1,000 instances of these hashtags. And prior to September, you'll see that the majority of the hashtags used were associated with Miles Kwok, and the others were associated with the Hong Kong riots. Most of the hashtags are in simplified or traditional Chinese. We do, as you just saw with the Uyghur example, we do occasionally see some hashtags in English. And after September, we can see that we've observed much more use of English hashtags, and we've seen the hashtag switch from the accounts that we're observing, switch from the majority being for Miles Kwok to the majority after September being focused on the activities or the protest in Hong Kong. One of the things you might take away from this slide, or just notice from this slide, is you'll notice that Hong Kong seems to be listed twice, and there seems to be some similarities. What happens is we have some of the hashtags are put out there in traditional Chinese characters, and other hashtags are put out there in simplified. And that's in the red box there. You can see the top one is listed as excuse me, simplified Chinese characters, and the bottom is traditional. And you notice that the first two characters look very much alike, but they are different encoding schemes. So when we collect them and sort them, they do pop up as individual hashtags versus the same hashtag. Jump into operational here. Operational times, we did see a pattern across the China workday. China itself has only one time zone for such a large country. Everything operates under China Standard Time, or Beijing time as they call it, with the majority of tweets that were going out associated with early morning, early workday in the People's Republic of China. With regard to tweets per weekday, we did see a bit of a spike on Monday and Tuesday. Not much, but a little bit. And then it was pretty much the same across the week with a little bit of variation. One of the things that might have really driven the Monday and Tuesday would have been that the weekend protests tended to be larger in Hong Kong, and we're making that assumption right now, but we can't draw a direct correlation to that. Account registration, no real significant pattern. There are some areas that look like there was some uptake, and but we also assume that the account registration may not be occurring in China. We have one suspicion that they are using external purchasing accounts, or I should say purchasing of accounts in other countries, whether it be Russia or Turkey. And then they also have folks within China that also broker accounts, which I'll speak about the brokering of accounts in a bit. But no significant patterns in account registration from what we have observed so far. During the celebration of the National Day in the People's Republic of China, which is October 1st, or what they call Xinjiang, we did see a significant drawback in operations. Even though these are considered automated accounts, we did see a number of the broadcasters, in this case Polo Acústico, completely drop off during the celebration of the National Day back in October. The case is not necessarily the same. We did see a bit of a drop-off for the New Year, which just occurred, started on January 25th, but overall the activity continued to increase. One of the reasons for this may have been due to the Wuhan coronavirus epidemic, a lot of people not traveling, and there was some, within the last days of January, we did observe some content that was associated with the Wuhan coronavirus from these operators. We try to build up some profile metrics, even though we know that these are fake accounts. I believe it was the New Yorker magazine used to have an old cartoon that on the internet nobody knows you're a dog. So these accounts do not necessarily correlate to who the operators are. Anybody can put any image or graphic up there or name their accounts what they want. But we were attempting to see if we could find any kind of patterns that may be useful. See if they were exploiting any biases for the people that were evaluating these accounts and making a determination, Twitter employees that might be making a determination whether or not to suspend the account or not. As you can see, we've broken it up into different languages and different writing systems. These are the majority of the languages that we've observed. In the case of languages, ASDF is just somebody running their fingers across the keyboard and coming up with some random sequences. And then we also observed accounts that were named using Cyrillic alphabet, Hanzi or Chinese characters, both short form and long form, and also Pinyin, which is a Romanized version of Chinese, which uses Latin characters. Dropping down into profile metrics of what they might be associated with, we made an attempt to break them out with regard to if they were potentially representing themselves as male or female or an organization. We did have a number of fake organizations. The Apple Daily is a large media organization in Hong Kong. We saw fake accounts come up for CNN, Deutsche Welle, and also using the fake verification symbol. On the right, we have an interesting one where we also saw them try to represent themselves as a law office based in Washington, D.C. Most of the operators tend to stay on target. We saw initially, but as it went forward, we would see that the content that the operators would be pushing out, instead of just being focused on Miles Kwok or just focused on Hong Kong, we would start to see some mixing, where one day it would just be Miles Kwok and the next day it would be Hong Kong related content. Typically, we saw the Xinjiang or Uyghur type content just be Uyghur content. They did not seem to cross those borders. But other operators would stay within their lanes, and some operators would target both groups. And we have a question here. Did you do anything was oriented towards recruitment? We did not see anything that was oriented towards recruitment on Twitter. I will show you an example of something that was oriented towards recruitment that was observed on Weixin in a couple more slides from here. Platform crossover was another thing that we rarely saw within the Twitter operators. With Facebook or YouTube, we would occasionally see with PTT, which is a Taiwanese message board, we would see platform crossover. But with the Twitter operators, it was relatively rare. Here is an example of where a Twitter operator is doing the platform crossover, directing you over to YouTube. But normally with the Twitter operators, it was very rare to see them either point to a website or any other kind of social media platform from the operators we observed. It did occasionally happen, as you saw in one of the previous tweets, HK Silent Majority, they were pointing them to HK Silent Majority's Instagram, to their Facebook, and to the web page, but it was very rare to see this platform crossover occur. It was normally just a single media image, a video, and text with very few other links. So over here on the left, we have an example of recruitment from whoever asked the question in the audience. On the left here is from Weixin, and here they're recruiting for Wang Lo Ping Lun Yan, which would be opinion influencer, network opinion influencer. And they're looking for somebody that's involved in what they call the Liang'an, or the two shores, Taiwan and the mainland. And they have a date that the work will go to until January 31st, which we make the assumption that in this case, and they are looking for somebody to go ahead and work to influence the Taiwanese elections of 2020. You'll also notice that their targets that they're looking to work on are PTT. PTT and Dcard are both social media platforms that are very popular in Taiwan, but outside of Taiwan, very few folks tend to participate except for mainland or overseas Chinese, overseas Taiwanese. It is primarily a Chinese language forum, as is Dcard. And then, of course, Facebook, which tends to be much more popular in Taiwan than Twitter. And we have another question here. Has there been an impact policy-wise from the influence campaigns? How much of this is for mainland consumption? Did we track booted dumplings? Well, I can't tell you right now if we track booted dumplings. I'll have to go back into my data set. It does not ring a bell with me. With regard to policy-wise impact from these influence campaigns, I haven't seen any. With regard to let's say Taiwan or the United States, I also haven't seen much of an impact from the Twitter campaign itself. There doesn't seem to be, as I said, there doesn't seem to be any authentic operators or accounts on Twitter that tend to be actively participating in these. It tends to be more of an echo chamber. And hopefully that answered your question. If not, please submit another. Actually, let me back up here. When I was talking earlier about purchasing aged accounts, on the right here is an offer to sell accounts. It allows people to go out and take a look at the accounts, get a sample of the accounts. In this slide, we'll see that I can get one account for approximately 50 cents US dollars. And it can go all the way up to about $228 if I want 10,000 followers and if I want an aged account. A lot of these, as you'll see on the right here, they give you different categories of accounts, how many followers they have, how old the account may be, and that tends to increase the price. We did observe that the aged accounts were typically used as the broadcasters. Those are the people that would just fire off a tweet, and then the other accounts would go in and retweet, like it, or potentially comment on it. Those being the repeaters or the amplifiers tended to be new accounts or newly registered accounts. Some patterns we observed. One of the more interesting patterns was we had a number of operators that every time before they would post their propaganda, they would run they would post about 3 different videos. And we can see here, we have the times that it was more or less used as either a distraction or a preamble. They would post a video, 3 videos every morning, and then after posting 3 videos, they would go ahead and post their information that was associated with the propaganda that they were trying to get out. This is a pattern that we observed with, we're calling it invasion of the body snatchers, where the accounts, and they were typically new accounts, every time they would register an account, the first thing they would do is they would post an image, and then they would go into some very obscure English statements, which I'll show in a bit. and then start on their daily propaganda diatribes or liking and retweeting accounts. We made an attempt to see if we could identify any of the images. We were not able, whether it be with Google Image or TinEye, to trace back where these images came from. Once they started into it, we started, of course, seeing the similarities in the content that was being sent across the wire, and building up a pattern with regard to what they would tweet on, what they wouldn't tweet on, and of course what type of preamble. Were they sharing the image of themselves beforehand? Were they using English content? This is an example of an aged account we consider a compromised account. The account was originally registered back in 2010. We're assumed that it was compromised sometime between 2010 and 2019, September 2019. Before October, we had English and Arabic, but no Chinese. And then on October 24th forward, we see full Chinese, no indications of English, no indications of Arabic. So I have a question. I have two questions in here. How many followers were estimated to have received the Twitter messages from the involved accounts overall? That we don't have the data of who was actually viewing it. The only data that we have is the retweet, the commenting, and the like. And we can extrapolate that data out from our collections, but I don't have those numbers offhand. The second question we have here is it all propaganda info or any video factual? Would Teabag me qualify as influence propagandist? Again, so with regard to the content, we look at it as propaganda. Propaganda can have a shred of truth to it. If there's something that we can't objectively define as being false, so we don't go ahead and call it disinformation. I use that example with regard to Wengui. Here's another pattern that we observed, and it was the use of net names. When we first observing this, the majority of the operators were using either English, Russian, or Turkish names. And we started to see an uptick in operators actually using Chinese names. In this case, they would use net names. Net names are very popular in China. While you must register your system with your real name, according to the regulations in China, a lot of people like to use a net name that has no association, just like a nickname outside of China. But we started to see a pattern within the net names. They typically were associated with poetry, music, or some type of literature. In this case, we have a net name that while they're not using Chinese characters, they are using Pinyin romanization for the net name. Musher can mean jade, and it's typically associated with a novel called Dream of the Red Chamber. And when one of the statements is uttered that, well, sure, Musher, it means that I am jade, and in the novel itself, it indicates that I have feminine characteristics. So we saw little groupings and clusters of these net names with not necessarily one-up serialization, but a numeric serialization. And we've been trying to figure out if we can do any kind of pattern analysis or pattern prediction for names, specifically because they're using the net names and because there are systems and lists of net names within China. So I can go to websites in China and generate a net name based upon the characteristics that I put into the system. To date, we've not been able to identify which list or which system all these generated net names have come from. But it's on our list to hopefully tackle sometime in 2020. The second, one of the other items that we saw with the account names is a pattern where they would use the standard Western format of given name and surname, and then, but within the account name, it would reverse to what you would typically see in the Far East, which is discern plus given name. We've also seen this on some non-influence or non-PRC influence op accounts. So we're not sure that this is a strong pattern, but it is something that we're observing and trying to make a determination whether we can use this as one of the 5 points going forward. We're trying to do a 5-point print on saying that, if you have these things together and the content, there's a higher likelihood that we are dealing with an inauthentic account. Finally, as I mentioned, there are occasional instances with the use of English. In this case, we've identified that the original posting was in Chinese, and they used machine translation to translate for the other post that was going out from another operator in English. And in this case, we can see that they probably used Baidu Translate and not Google Translate, based upon the mistake that was made in identifying Steve Bannon's name as a hashtag. If you use Google Translate and put in the hashtag Bannong, you'll get out Bannon. But if you use Baidu Translate, you get the Bangnong Bang, which is there are no 3 syllables in the hashtag itself. So using the error there to indicate that they're probably using Baidu's translate system, machine translation, to incorrectly translate the Chinese tweet into English before pushing it out. Good question here. I'll save the question there until the end. This is what we're calling chaff. People may not be, well, when I was doing the review, I found out that the term chaff is not as popular as I thought it was. Chaff is something that you use as a countermeasure, whether it be on a ship, an aircraft, or a tank, where you're shooting a flare to distract the missile or some type of armament from attacking you. And we identified what we considered chaff or countermeasures within some of the content that these operators were pushing out. In this case, we have some very obscure, unusual English sentences that they would tend to repeat in patterns as they were registering new operators. We think that they may be using this as a way of distracting anybody that is monitoring this or using automation to monitor it and looking for consistent Chinese language, consistent Chinese characters, making it look more of an authentic account. We saw some of the sentences that were used in English that you would not normally hear a normal English speaker or native English speakers use, and we were able to trace some of those sentences back to usage dictionaries, online usage dictionaries in China, but we're not able to find those sentences anywhere else. Another item that they tend to use is what's considered the white left. Baizuo, white left, is a derogatory term that you'll find in mainland China, and it typically attacks the liberal values of the West. And in this case, you'll see that they will jam up their profile with a number of what would be considered, I won't use not necessarily sensitive terms, but terms that are associated with Western liberal values, try to identify themselves as they come from specific countries, they have specific religion, sexual preferences, and using this as kind of a weaponization of a profile against anybody that is reviewing it that might make them think twice about, well, this is an inauthentic account. We see this quite frequently, probably starting in about November. We saw this more and more often. Another item is language shift. As I mentioned, they would go from English and then into Chinese. The English would really have no bearing on any of the follow-on content. It would be random sentences. This is a pattern that we've been indicating off, that we see tweets going out initially in Hindi, Russian, and then English. They might cover across a few languages. The account owner is in Cyrillic, and but you never see any content that is in Cyrillic. the content is only in Chinese. In the case of Hindi, we never observed anybody actually using Hindi text or Devanagari script. Everything was image-based with Hindi on it. They would post a few images with some text on it, and then they would go in a day or two, or sometimes even on the same day after registering the account, they would go into straight Chinese and propaganda type content. And then finally, the guilt trip. We saw this quite frequently. We see this on Facebook. We see some operators, both authentic and inauthentic, posting images on this. You're blocking me just because I support the Chinese government, and kind of tempting people to go ahead and take them down. In this case, they're using long-form Chinese, which is standard in Hong Kong and also in Taiwan. Now we'll look a little bit with intimidation, and intimidation is different. That it's the bots that I've just described. Intimidation typically is not associated with these, except in the case of sex shaming. The people associated with the intimidation campaigns appear to be more or less real, authentic individuals versus bots. They tend to focus on what's called Renro, or Wenro Sosol, which is human flesh search engines. On the left there, we have a recent screenshot from the Honker Union of China, indicating that they claim that human flesh search engines, or doxing, is actually Chinese technology. And what they've done is they've set up Telegram channels, websites. You'll see them on Twitter, Facebook, and a number of other social mediums, where they're out there and their entire job is to identify anybody that may be speaking ill of mainland China, the Communist Party of China, the leadership of Hong Kong, identify them and dox them with as much information as possible, put that information out there and make it public, and in some cases actually report it to the central government. We saw a heavy use of sexual shaming and fake porn ads with regard to Hong Kong. Tweets where in the doxing they would go out and either generate a fake porno video, not a fake porno video, excuse me, the cover to a porno video. We didn't see any deep fake videos, or they would get personal photos that would have people in sexually compromising positions and out those videos and associate those people with leadership within Hong Kong or within the protest. We saw a significant amount of this activity in late October and in November. Then we have what are called the vicious dogs, Osugo. And these are doxing sites. These are active on Twitter. They have Twitter profile. Twitter has been made aware of these profiles. They are specifically associated with doxing any individuals that are associated with either Hong Kong independence, Hong Kong protests, Taiwan independence, or again, anything that goes against the PRC. And these sites are still up. And what they do is they collect the information, and it appears they report this information to a platform in the People's Republic of China that I'll speak about here in a moment. But if you go out, you can get to Osugo and these Twitter accounts, and these are just two of many that are out there. Osugo is just one website of many that are associated with doxing individuals that may post something out there that runs counter to the Chinese central government, or in one case, posting any kind of comical or parody information against the leadership of China. In this case, we have, this is a site that is set up in the People's Republic of China. It's 12337. I'm sorry, there's a typo there in the bullet. Excuse me. This is a site for reporting. Originally, it was set up for tracking and reporting spies and espionage in China. Now it's used for anything that would be considered running against party ideology or central government ideology, which is one and the same. Now, what's interesting about the Osugo site is that the one that has, it has a website and it has a presence on Twitter. is that when it was initially registered, it was sitting on the same IP where 12337.cn is sitting. And that original IP, there are only Chinese government sites. We don't have any other commercial sites. It's since moved out to an IP associated with Cloudflare. But what appears to be just a randomly developed by a civilian doxing site does have an origin associated with the PRC government. And this is the only time we were able to draw a direct correlation from some of these influence operations back to government origin. Now let's speak a little bit about pacification. We don't know this to be associated with any of the Twitter bots. We make an assumption that it was associated with the doxing efforts that we're seeing on Twitter and some other channels. We have a University of Minnesota student that was, the news recently came out. He was arrested this summer in the People's Republic of China. If you look over on the right here, he posted some graphics of Xi Jinping, the leader of the People's Republic of China. And some of them were more or less parody or what we would consider humorous. And he was convicted under PRC law of what's called picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Supposedly spent 6 months in confinement. It's unclear whether or not they used the 12337 or the Usugo or any of the other doxing websites out there to identify this individual. But this is a case of pacification where where we have online influence operations, we have online doxing that's going on. It appears to be supported by the PRC government. And here's a case where they've actually not only been able to shut down a person online, but actually put them in confinement, arrest them and put them in confinement. So I have a question, is there any chance these multi-use accounts that could potentially be used to track, infect, or spy on a compromised or target group? There is a potential of that. We did not observe any malware or links to malware associated with any of the tweets that we were observing, with any of the activity outside of Twitter. With regard to these IO operations. Could they do something with some of the doxing sites that they control? Yes, but we did not observe any of that. Now this steps out a little bit from what we've observing. It's kind of a bonus round of information. With regard to Twitter, we don't have any access to information of how these accounts are accessing Twitter. We have an expectation that they are purchasing the aged accounts from these brokers out there, that they're signing up new accounts. There are plenty of services within China and outside of China where you can buy a brand new Twitter account. But one of the things that we don't have is we don't know, what VPNs are coming through, how are they accessing from China. What we can do is understand potentially that they are using the same method they are using on other social media services. And in this example, we're using data from the Taiwanese message board social media service known as PTT, where we've observed that the operators that tend to come in, the influence operations that tend to come in on PTT, they will use VPSs, virtual private servers, and VPNs, but more often than not VPSs, based in the United States. And these VPSs tend to have some kind of tie to China, where they advertise significantly in China, one hop to the United States to get to your VPS, and they also tend to do their configuration of their servers, where you have localized Chinese operating systems, whether they be Windows, excuse me, or Linux. We've also seen this pattern in other Chinese operations, specifically cyber espionage. And a lot of these names of VPS operators, PTT allows you to see the IP of the poster. And the way we were able to track this is occasionally they would make a mistake and not be connected to their VPN or their tunnel to the VPS, and their local PRC or mainland China IP would come up. So it's kind of what we would call an intelligence of bead window event. Inadvertent compromise, we saw that. We tracked it to their normal logins, their IPs that they were coming from, and they were traditionally coming from these VPSs. They were small VPSs in the United States and Canada that specifically advertised their services in China. Again, we don't have direct correlation to Twitter. We don't have any data from Twitter regarding these VPS accounts or how they are accessing Twitter from their own domain. And then finally, this is a case of insider threat, and specifically within Twitter. We've seen a recent arrest of Saudi, or they're accused of penetrating Twitter, 2 Saudi individuals, the FBI claims. Back in 2018, we saw a former Twitter employee get online on Twitter and claimed that the China's Ministry of State Security, when he posted it in English, he called it NSA, but he is speaking of China's Ministry of State Security, apparently called him in when he was home in China, attempting him to do something nefarious within Twitter. My understanding is this individual has since left Twitter, but it's an indication of that foreign influence operators, foreign intelligence services, social media platforms are a very high target for them for penetration, either owning somebody that's already in there or getting somebody into these platforms. Coming up on time here, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up. The Twitter campaigns were very narrowly focused. As I mentioned, the 2 main campaigns, Miles Kwok in Hong Kong, rarely did they stray out of those lanes. They were primarily targeted at a Chinese-speaking audience, whether it be short form or long form, character sets. The intended target of these campaigns were people in Taiwan, Singapore, domestic consumption of people reading Twitter. And then occasionally we did have those Xinjiang campaigns, which tended to cross different boundaries because it was more graphical in nature, less textual in nature. The content was more of graphic media. Find the campaigns and the operators to be relatively easy to track, at least these classification of inauthentic operators. It wouldn't say that there was very much difficulty in tracking them. It was more a matter of there were just so many of them to try to collect. We did try to reach out to Twitter on some of this, slow or zero response, and we did have one instance of reporting it online, and Twitter researcher was banned. So we don't have any interaction with Twitter on this. This has all been done outside of Twitter, or at least working with Twitter corporate. There's been no collaboration, so I just wanted to get that in there. No significant ties to the PRC government except for the Usugo website. We cannot confirm that these are not people, the operators were not paid, or at least to set up this campaign by somebody that may be outside of the government and just wishing to push kind of a political statement, but we have no high ties to the PRC government. With regard to risks, we did see some brand usage where they would mimic some commercial brands, and I'm not talking about media outlets, but I think you may have reputational impact, especially with Hong Kong, since there's boycotts on both sides of the Hong Kong protest with regards to specific brands that are assumed to be supporting the PRC or supporting the protesters. There may be some risk there, but outside of that, there seems to be very little commercial risks to these influence operators. The bots themselves, as I mentioned, are an echo chamber. They really seem to talk amongst themselves. We don't see them really influencing anything. We occasionally, as you can see in one of the tweets here we have a person running in there, but they immediately identify who they're talking to as what would be considered a 50 center. And there doesn't seem to really be any kind of influence out of these. It's almost appears like it's a wasted effort currently. And we're going to continue to monitor it to see if they change their operational tempo or they change their operational content and maybe gain some kind of traction. But we didn't see significant influence, and we don't assess a current high risk or medium risk. It seems to be a low risk operation currently. Intimidation campaigns, very high risk. We've got reputational damage, we've got arrests that we've observed, and legal issues. And those legal issues can also cascade out to commercial enterprises or any enterprises that appear to support one way or another. Cathay Pacific is an interesting one where they lost their CEO and they lost a number of employees. Specifically, the employees were outed on social media, and they were removed from the positions at Cathay Pacific so that they could stay in the good graces of the central government in China. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
All right, Tom, it looks like there's a few questions from the audience. Did you get to all of those?
Yeah, two of them I'm going to have to skip.
Okay. All right, so we did have one more question, a few more questions actually. So what geopolitical events do you foresee affecting China's influence operations in the coming year?
Well, I would consider the Wuhan virus. I would see that we did see some indications that the coronavirus was starting to get some play on some of these campaigns. I would see any of the freedom of navigation operations by U.S. or Japan or any other country, either in the East China Sea or South China Sea, possibly playing into this, but more targeted targeted at a domestic audience. I would also expect that if these are government operations, that at some point in time they would have to cross the boundary outside of Chinese language only type operations. But we have yet to see that. Most of the stuff that they've done in number one in Chinese and in English. We haven't seen any Japanese or Korean, which also tend to be a target or a potential target for these influence operators. We haven't seen that really surface.
Okay, Tom, well, that concludes our time for the day. Any other questions we can answer over email if you wish. So thank you everyone who attended today's webinar. A link to the recording of today's webinar will be sent out to each of you tomorrow and will also be available on our website and on our YouTube page for additional viewing. Feel free to pass this along and share this presentation with your colleagues. Thank you for viewing.